everyone. This week's topic is the gods and the pantheons. Thus far, we've been talking about gods a little bit through myths of the creation. We talked about those gods who bring creation into existence, bring the universe into existence. And through our discussion of the apocalypse, we also talked about some gods that are involved in the end of days and the processes involved in the end of the world or the end of the universe coming about, or the renewal or regeneration in connection to a new cycle. But today we come to pantheons and to groups of gods and goddesses. And so I think it's a good idea, first of all, to consider what the nature of gods and goddesses is. So I'd like to begin first by defining what we see as gods in the various mythologies that we come to, the various tales that we come to. So we want to ask ourselves the question, who or what are the gods in connection to us? And this is one of the key questions that myth seeks to answer. What is our place in the universe? What is our connection to the divine? So we see the gods as supernatural beings. They're usually superior to humans in power and splendor. And sometimes they may take on animal or human shape. Now, this will certainly vary depending on the culture. So we may sometimes see gods and goddesses as represented as very beautiful human beings, for example, sort of the ideal aesthetic. Sometimes we, as in lots of Greek myth, yes. In contrast, sometimes we may see gods and goddesses as represented as part human, part animal, as in Egyptian myth. We may also see gods and goddesses represented as part male, part female, part animal, and any kind of combination of those things. So the ways that the gods, or the way that the gods are represented, is very much culturally determined. So it's unique culture to culture. Gods often have spheres of influence, aspects of the world that they control. Sometimes they may also control forces of nature. Thunder, storms, rain, fire, earthquakes, fertility, any of these things. Gods are seen as metaphors for elements of human society. So they reflect our family lives, or they can be personifications of nature. Sometimes we may see that gods are more like concepts because they are metaphorical in nature than real anthropomorphized beings. So it's important to keep in mind that even if they're represented as humans, they're not human in nature or characteristics. They can sometimes be enormous. They can be very beautiful. They can sometimes be very, very ugly. Often, when it comes to gods and goddesses, the inner appearance reflects the outer appearance, or the inner sphere of influence reflects the outer appearance. So it may be the case that a god of death, for example, may be particularly ugly because death is seen as a terrifying, horrible thing. In contrast, a goddess of sex, fertility, and love may be absolutely beautiful because that sphere of influence, or those items, are seen as beautiful or wonderful. Sometimes the gods and goddesses are concepts or abstractions without defined personalities. So they may be vague in nature, but sometimes their personalities are very defined and very detailed, and they are almost human. The events that are surrounding the gods and their actions often happen before or outside of the present order of things, where time and space have different meanings than those that are familiar to us. I often get questions about chronology when it comes to myth. Well, if this happened first, how could this happen next? Or how could this happen if this hasn't happened yet? What's important for us to remember is that myth does not operate in time and space as we understand it as human beings. It operates on a whole different plane, a whole different universe of its own, really, in essence. It is also far removed from our familiar world. So it is largely based in the imagination. Now, this is not to say that there aren't characteristics of myth that may connect to history and historical events. Yes, this is true. But in essence, myth is highly symbolic, highly abstract, and very, very imagined. This is why it's so connected to our collective unconscious. Yes, our dreamlike mind. But we'll come to that later on. Many of the gods about which tales were told were also worshipped. And so it's important here to distinguish between myth and religion. And this has been mentioned before, but I'll mention it again just to be clear. This comes to us from Barry Powell, who wrote a book called World Myth. And in it, he says that myths are socially important stories, just as I have mentioned before. Whether they're true or untrue makes no difference to us in terms of their academic study. Religion, in contrast, is belief and the course of action that follows from that belief. So I'll explain this a little bit more. What's important to us is that the myths are socially important stories. However, the gods and goddesses that these myths are about are often worshipped. This enters the space of religion, because as soon as we believe in a god or goddess, it drives us to a course of action that is connected to religion and religious institutions as they have grown and evolved. A belief, Powell defines, is what you accept with or without proof as a basis for action. So it might be the case that if we believe in Jesus, for example, we will go to church. Yes, so the belief is there, and then we take that action. We can contrast this to myth and the very basic definition that myths are socially important, traditional stories. So we want to keep a clear distinction between religion and myth here. It's not to say the two aren't connected, but we want to stay firmly in the place of evaluating myths academically and considering their social importance as stories that have persisted over time. Barry Powell says, myth is a traditional story with collective importance. Religion is a set of beliefs that motivates a course of action. So very different. From stories about the gods and goddesses, however, we often learn about the origin of cultural customs and practices, and those are actions. Okay? So within this course, we're really looking at these stories as socially important, as traditional. We're not necessarily concerned so much with the course of action that comes from believing in the stories themselves. Okay? So this describes for us a little bit about the gods and their nature, their components, their elements, their characteristics. We also need to define the term pantheon. A pantheon comes from Greek pan, theon, meaning all gods. A pantheon is a group of officially recognized gods of a culture. They reflect, or it reflects, a pantheon reflects a culture's value system and view of itself. So, just to reiterate that, the pantheon, or the group of gods, reflects the culture's value system and what the culture views itself as, the culture's view of itself. So this is an important point of introspection, yes? Because if we think about diversity and we think about different cultures and the way we view them, we're largely viewing cultures as the other. Yes? So for example, if I'm looking at Ethiopian culture, I'm viewing Ethiopian culture as the other, as the person outside of that culture. But people inside that culture will have their own perspective on themselves, their own perception of themselves, their own view of themselves. Yes? And they will have their own myths. And they may have a pantheon of gods that reflect their view of themselves. So this is why myth is so interesting, because it really gives us a window into how cultures see themselves, separate from us. The gods and goddesses in the pantheon of any given culture often represent the parts of the culture or society that are particularly important. And I have mentioned that we won't study much Greek myth in this course. However, I'd like to use the Greek pantheon and the first 6 Olympians as a really good example of this idea. So if we consider that a pantheon represents the parts of a culture or society that are important, then we can look at the first 6 Greek Olympians as representing the most important parts of ancient Greek culture. So they are, I'll give them to you here, Zeus, before he becomes the one god, really. Okay, so we won't be concerned with the succession myths surrounding Greek myth and the battles that ensued and those kinds of things. Considering him just as one of the 6, yes? Zeus, god of the sky or the weather. Hades, god of the underworld, which is connected to death, though Hades is not the god of death. Poseidon, god of the sea. Hera, goddess of marriage and family. Believe it or not. If you know anything about Hera, that might be surprising to you. Demeter, goddess of fertility and agriculture. Hestia, goddess of the hearth and the home. Hestia is not as well known in terms of the Olympians. She's a lesser known god, that's for sure. But she's in the first 6 for a very important reason. From these first 6 gods and goddesses, the first 6 Olympians, 3 of which are male and 3 of which are female, which reflects a real balance of male and female energy, we can see the 6 most important aspects of Greek culture, Greek society, Greek concern. Yes? The weather. If we consider the Mediterranean and where Greece is, we know that it's surrounded on 3 sides by water. Poseidon, god of the sea. If we are surrounded by water, the sea is really important to you, and likely fishing is a part of that culture. You're going to need to explain why the sea functions the way it does. Why is it angry some days and peaceful others? Hades, the god of the underworld. We're all concerned about where we go after we die. Hera, marriage and the family. Family and marriage was an extremely important aspect of ancient Greek culture. Demeter, fertility and agriculture. So fertility in terms of offspring as well, having children, yes, and keeping the family line going, but also growing crops. So we can imagine or anticipate that that was an important part of ancient Greek culture. And then Hestia, goddess of the hearth and the home, the center of the Greek family. So we've got home, agriculture, marriage and family, the sea, the underworld, and the weather. 6 key aspects of ancient Greek culture represented by the first 6 Olympians. So this is the purpose of a pantheon. This is really what a pantheon does, is it represents to us the key aspects of any culture. Now, the Greek immortal family, and as we haven't mentioned yet, yes, gods and goddesses are immortal, yes. The family was preoccupied by its own pleasures. This is the family of gods and goddesses, the pantheon itself. And it's by its own pleasures and the actions of mortals. So the gods and goddesses are concerned with themselves, and they're also concerned with what mortals are doing, yes, and their relationships with those mortals. There is that moment in that movie with Brad Pitt, the movie about Troy with Brad Pitt, where who plays Achilles, yes, and Brad Pitt says, "It is the gods who are jealous of us. We are jealous of the gods because of their immortality, but actually it's the gods who are jealous of us because of our mortality. Life is sweeter when you know you're going to die." Okay. The Greek pantheon then personifies a realistic and somewhat skeptical view of human nature and the dilemma of a species that delights in life as it is defined by death. This is a key point of emphasis, as Brad Pitt mentions, as Achilles in that movie Troy. This concern with being mortal or being immortal and what the benefits of each are. That contrast is really important. In the Egyptian pantheon, in contrast, we see a reflection of the fascination with death and resurrection. We see the effects of the passage of the sun, and we see the effects of the flooding of the Nile, because the Nile River is central to Egyptian culture. So in the Egyptian pantheon then, we have gods and goddesses surfacing like Shu, the life spirit, Tefnut, the world order. We have Geb, the spirit of life and the earth. And then we have Nut, the spirit of the sky, who is the great mother goddess. Yes. We have Set, god of death and darkness. We have Horus, god of light, who is often represented by a falcon. We have Isis, who represents sometimes the earth and often the moon. Right? Various aspects of the culture come out, okay? In contrast, in the Hebrew development of a single patriarchal god, so a series of sort of, in this case, a monotheistic tradition, yes, one god, concerned with the actions of a chosen people, we can see that there is a culture with a sense of exclusive identity and a sense of mission. So these are just a few examples of themes in terms of pantheons. All pantheons are ontological. They deal with the nature of being. So why are we here? Yes. And they are teleological. They reveal the design and the purpose of all items in the world. The design and the purpose. They are metaphors for the human attempt to make sense of existence and to assign an ultimate cause to existence. How did we get here? Why are we here? These are just ongoing central questions. David Leeming says, "To read a pantheon is to read a culture's sense of itself and the nature of the cosmos." So in terms of the gods and goddesses themselves, I'll just give you a few examples. All right, so we may have sky gods, sun and moon gods. Usually the god of the sun, usually the god of the sun is male, and the god of the moon is a goddess, female. That came out wrong. Except Thoth in the Egyptian pantheon, who is the Egyptian lord of the moon. But characteristically, the sun is a male god and the moon is a female goddess. We may also have weather gods. We have fertility and agriculture gods, as I've already mentioned. So some examples are Njord, the Norse god of wind, sea, and fire, whose children, Freyr and Freya, are the god and goddess of fertility. Freya is the goddess of love, fertility, and sexuality. She is said to travel in a chariot drawn by cats. She assists women in labor, and she also helps to protect the dead. She's associated with wealth and with their earth. In ancient Egyptian culture, Hathor, Sopdet, Bastet, and Taweret are all revered along with Isis as fertility goddesses. The sky deity Hathor, goddess of love, music, and dancing, is also associated with the fertile cow, who is important to Egyptian culture. Hathor is also the queen of the date palm and the goddess who provides nourishment for the dead. So again, it's important to consider that fertility usually comes in the form of a goddess, and that it's connected to childbirth and offspring, as well as fertility from the land. So, and also fertility of livestock, yes. And so crops, agriculture are usually part of that sphere of influence of those particular goddesses. Gods may oversee forests and cultivated lands, but also mountains, rivers, and oceans. The Nile is ruled by Egyptian god Hapi, Hapi, and then Sebek, another Egyptian water deity, assumes the form of a crocodile to rule streams and lakes. We should be careful when we travel along those. In China, the monster god Gong Gong commands underground rivers, while Hebo commands those on the surface. So here we have quite a few gods and goddesses in their connection to water. We also have sea gods. As mentioned, we have blacksmith gods. They are quite popular. We also have fire gods. So in China, the fire god Zhurong becomes ruler of the universe when he defeats Gong Gong, the water god. Agni, the fire god of India, oversees sacrificial offerings and purifies the dead when their bodies are burned. Atar, the fire god of ancient Persia, serves his father Ahura Mazda, who we have already met in the Zoroastrian myth, creation myth, as a warrior who represents goodness and light in the cosmic battle of darkness and evil. We also have gods of death. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, we have Ur-Shanabi, who is the ferryman who carries the hero across the waters of death. In Mesopotamian accounts of Inanna's descent to the underworld, we have the 7 judges who preside there. They refuse to let the goddess leave until she agrees to send a substitute to the realm of the dead. We'll get to that story and all of its complications. In myths of India, Yama, the king of the underworld, often judges the death as well. We have gods or goddesses of war. So, for example, Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love and fertility, is also a war deity. In Indian culture, we have Durga, Kali, and Meenakshi, who all embody warlike or destructive aspects of Devi, the goddess of all, or the one goddess. Additionally, we have trickster gods, gods of wisdom and the arts, goddesses of the hunt, goddesses of fate, goddesses of the underworld. In Mesopotamian myth, the goddess who governs the underworld is Ereshkigal, who we will come to, the older sister of Inanna, or also known as Ishtar, the goddess of the heavens. So these are just some examples of gods and goddesses that exist in the various pantheons that we will come to. Some final thoughts from David Leeming here. He says that world mythology is dominated by the concepts of God and goddess, and they are immortal. They overcome the physical laws of death and disintegration. I've mentioned before that one of the key aspects of creation and myths around creation is that the moment we are born, we begin to die. And so the emphasis on immortality here amongst the gods is that they are free of death. They are free of the forces of decay and disintegration that we carry with us throughout our entire human lives. He says, gods and goddesses represent the creative force that struggles against the tendency toward the equilibrium of nothingness, the force that works to fill the world with life. If there are no gods and goddesses, Leeming is arguing, then there is just a whole bunch of nothing. So we fill that space with the divine in all its forms. Finally, he argues that the gods and goddesses are symbols of ultimate reality. They provide us with a sense of significance in an otherwise random universe. They help us to establish a kind of order within the chaos. And as mentioned before, to indicate the values that are important to our cultures.